The year was 1371, and in the mountainous province of Yunnan, far from the imperial heart of China, a Muslim boy named Ma He was born into a family that traced its heritage back to Central Asia. He could never have imagined the destiny that awaited him. At the time of his birth, the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty was in collapse, and the Ming dynasty was poised to rise. Ma He's childhood, marked by upheaval, would be the foundation for one of the most extraordinary naval careers in human history. At the age of 10, Ma He's life took a tragic and transformative turn. Ming forces invaded Yunnan in a campaign to extinguish the remnants of Mongol loyalists. During the conquest, he was captured by imperial troops. As was common in the Ming court, young captives who showed intelligence and loyalty were turned into eunuchs to serve the emperor. Ma He suffered this fate and was castrated, his identity forever altered. But while his physical freedom was taken, his opportunity for advancement soared. Ma He was sent to serve in the household of Zhu Di, the ambitious and brilliant fourth son of the founding Ming emperor. Under Zhu Di's guidance, Ma He proved himself capable, diplomatic, and fiercely intelligent. He mastered the arts of court etiquette, military strategy, and foreign languages. Over the years, he rose through the ranks, becoming one of Zhu Di's most trusted advisors. In 1402, Zhu Di seized the imperial throne through a violent coup, becoming the Yongle emperor. This moment would change China's trajectory, and Ma He's life, forever. As a reward for his loyalty and service, the emperor granted Ma He a new name, Zheng. With it came new responsibilities, and a vision that would stretch far beyond the walls of the Forbidden City. Yongle was not like other emperors. His rule was aggressive, ambitious, and outward-facing. He sought not only to consolidate China's power at home but also to reassert its influence abroad. China had long been a cultural superpower, but now the emperor envisioned a maritime empire, an armada so large and impressive it would awe the known world. To realize this dream, he needed a leader. A man of both courtly finesse and military experience. Someone who could command a fleet, negotiate with kings, and represent the majesty of the Ming court. He chose Zheng. By 1405, preparations were underway for a naval expedition unlike any the world had ever seen. Massive shipyards along the Yangtze River bustled with activity. Artisans, engineers, and sailors worked day and night to build the vessels that would carry China's message across the seas. These were no ordinary ships. The largest among them, called treasure ships, were said to stretch over 400 feet in length, towering over the fleets of other empires. Each ship was a floating fortress, capable of carrying hundreds of men, weapons, goods, and imperial gifts. As the admiral of this vast armada, Zheng stood at the helm of not only a fleet, but a mission of diplomacy, tribute, and dominance. His role was to navigate the oceans, establish relations, bring foreign rulers into the Ming tributary system, and return with wonders that would glorify the emperor's reign. Zheng, the orphaned eunuch boy from Yunnan, had become the face of China's maritime future. And now, he was preparing to lead an expedition into the vast, uncharted waters of the Indian Ocean, one that would carry him to the edges of the known world. In the summer of 1405, the waters of the Yangtze River churned with the might of the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. Nearly 300 ships, including dozens of massive treasure ships, stood ready. The scale was staggering. Some of these vessels were so large that sailors from other nations would later dismiss their descriptions as myths. But they were very real. Wooden hulls reinforced with iron nails. Compartments for stability. Multiple decks. Some ships carried horses and soldiers. Others were laden with silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and tea, the finest goods of Ming China. Zheng, now a grand eunuch and admiral of the fleet, stood on the deck of the flagship. Around him bustled a floating city, 27,000 men, including soldiers, sailors, doctors, interpreters, astrologers, and even entertainers. The expedition was not only a show of naval dominance but also a cultural mission, a voyage to dazzle the world with the sophistication and power of the Ming dynasty. The objective was both practical and symbolic. Zheng's fleet was tasked with projecting imperial authority across the seas, collecting tribute from foreign rulers, establishing diplomatic relations, and securing maritime trade routes. At the same time, these voyages were intended to reinforce China's claim as the cultural and political center of the known world, what the Chinese called the Middle Kingdom. The first voyage took the fleet south along the coast of China, through the Strait of Malacca, and into the waters of Southeast Asia. Ports in Kampa, modern-day Vietnam, Java, and Sumatra welcomed the Chinese with a mixture of awe and anxiety. No nation had ever seen anything like it. Hundreds of ships, some 8 times the size of their own, flying the red and gold banners of the Ming. Zheng He's men engaged in trade and diplomacy with local rulers, offering imperial gifts in exchange for tribute. These offerings were not demands of conquest, but rather proposals for mutual recognition. By entering the Ming tribute system, a ruler acknowledged the symbolic supremacy of the Chinese emperor and, in return, received favor, protection, and lavish gifts. The fleet then continued westward, across the Bay of Bengal, visiting the great ports of Bengal and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Here, Zheng He encountered diverse cultures, religions, and political rivalries. Some leaders eagerly welcomed the Chinese envoys. Others resisted. In Ceylon, a local king named Alagakanara grew suspicious of the fleet's presence. Tensions escalated. Skirmishes broke out. Zheng He, not only a diplomat but also a seasoned military commander, led a retaliatory force that defeated the king's army and captured the ruler himself. In a daring move, Zheng He transported the defiant monarch back to China in chains, where he was forced to kneel before the Yongle emperor. It was a message to the world: those who disrespected the Ming would not be tolerated. And yet, Zheng He did not seek conquest. After the incident, the emperor pardoned the king and sent him back to Ceylon, with gifts. The goal was not colonization, but influence. By the time the fleet returned to China in 1407, it had traveled thousands of miles, visited dozens of kingdoms, and returned with tributes that included exotic animals, rare spices, and precious gems. The voyage was hailed as a resounding success. But it was only the beginning. The Yongle emperor, pleased with the results, ordered another mission. And another. Zheng He would ultimately lead 7 voyages in total, each larger and more ambitious than the last, sailing as far as Arabia and the east coast of Africa. What began as one man's rise through the imperial ranks had become a maritime odyssey that reshaped China's relationship with the wider world. By 1408, the name Zheng He was becoming legendary in the ports of Asia. The colossal ships of the Ming treasure fleet were more than symbols of imperial power. They were messengers of a far-reaching vision, where diplomacy, trade, and military strength all moved together under the dragon banner of China. On his second and third voyages, Zheng He turned his eyes farther west. The fleet crossed the Indian Ocean, a sea route that had, for centuries, connected merchants from Arabia, East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. The Chinese had long traded with these regions in smaller numbers, but now the interaction was amplified tenfold. What had once been private enterprise now bore the unmistakable weight of empire. The monsoon winds that carried dhows and merchant ships from Africa to India also bore the sails of Zheng He's fleet. Navigators aboard the treasure ships studied the stars, wind patterns, and ocean currents. Chinese mariners of the time were among the most skilled in the world, and their navigational tools, magnetic compasses, star maps, and detailed sea charts, were far more advanced than many of their Western counterparts. The fleet made port in Calicut on the southwest coast of India, a major center of trade and culture. Here, they were received by the local Hindu ruler, the Zamarin, with ceremony and respect. The Chinese presented silks, porcelain, and lacquerware. In return, they received pepper, cotton, gemstones, and exotic woods. The diplomatic exchange was formalized through tribute and titles, reinforcing the Ming emperor's image as the supreme ruler of all under heaven. Not all encounters were peaceful, however. In some ports, rival factions vied for Ming favor. In others, pirates and hostile kingdoms sought to resist. Zheng He, though primarily a diplomat, was never without force. His fleet carried thousands of soldiers, and several ships were equipped for battle. When necessary, he responded to aggression with decisive action. On one voyage, he pursued a notorious pirate fleet that had been harassing trade routes in the Malacca Strait. Zheng He's ships tracked them down, engaged in naval combat, and captured the pirate leader. The pirates were executed, and the local sea lanes were made safer. It was a clear demonstration of China's growing ability not just to trade, but to project power across the oceans. The presence of the Ming fleet rippled far beyond commerce. It altered the political calculus of kingdoms large and small. Rulers who had once dealt only with Indian or Arab traders now had to consider their posture toward China. Some sent ambassadors to the Ming court, eager to establish ties. Others feared the implications of such a powerful neighbor. But for Zheng He, diplomacy was more than politics. It was theater, an extension of imperial magnificence. The fleet often staged elaborate processions when arriving at a port. Musicians played, banners waved, translators announced messages in multiple languages, and ceremonial gifts were presented with choreography worthy of an emperor himself. These spectacles served a purpose. In a time before mass communication, Zheng He's pageantry delivered a message that was hard to ignore. China was watching. China was present. And China could not be challenged without consequence. The third voyage ended in 1411, and once again the fleet returned home with cargo holds brimming with treasure and the names of distant kings etched into imperial records. Zheng He was no longer simply an admiral. He was the embodiment of China's global reach, a eunuch from Yunnan who now commanded respect from Mecca to Malacca. But his greatest journeys were still to come. In the years following Zheng He's early voyages, the Ming court transformed into a gallery of foreign marvels. The treasure fleet returned not only with goods for trade but with rare animals, dazzling gems, and tales that left the imperial court in awe. During the fourth voyage, which began in 1413, Zheng He sailed farther west than ever before, reaching the Arabian Peninsula. His ships docked in ports such as Hormuz and Aden, ancient centers of trade where merchants from Africa, India, and the Islamic world exchanged goods and ideas. There, Zheng He met Muslim rulers and scholars, strengthening China's ties with the wider Islamic world, a bond he was uniquely suited to forge as a Muslim himself. At these courts, he exchanged tributes on behalf of the Yongle Emperor, scrolls bearing imperial decrees, silk banners embroidered with dragon motifs, jade figurines, and other luxurious symbols of China's refinement. In return, Arab and Persian rulers offered pearls, frankincense, myrrh, rare spices, and, most famously, living creatures never before seen in China. Among these gifts was a giraffe. It arrived from the court of the Sultan of Bengal, who had received it from a trader in East Africa. When the animal was presented to the Yongle Emperor, it caused a sensation. The giraffe, with its long neck and graceful stride, was hailed as a qilin, a mythical beast said to appear only in times of great peace and virtue. Courtiers bowed in reverence, artists rushed to depict it, and poets praised it in verse. It was not merely a curiosity, it was a divine sign, interpreted as proof of the emperor's heavenly mandate. Other creatures followed: zebras, ostriches, lions. The imperial menagerie swelled with wonders from faraway lands. These were more than diplomatic offerings. They were symbols of China's position at the center of the world. But behind the pageantry, there was strategy. Zheng He's voyages extended the reach of Chinese soft power. He offered aid to weaker states, secured trade with wealthier ones, and presented the Ming dynasty as a benevolent guardian of order. Rather than using force to colonize, he made it desirable for foreign leaders to align themselves with China. This tribute system, often misunderstood in the West, was not based purely on coercion. Foreign states that entered into it received Chinese goods, military protection, and prestige. In the Confucian worldview, this hierarchy mirrored the natural order, the emperor as the sun, surrounded by vassals orbiting in loyalty. Still, Zheng He remained prepared for conflict. In the port of Samudra, on the northern coast of Sumatra, a usurper attempted to seize power while the rightful ruler was away. Zheng He intervened militarily, restoring the original monarch and reasserting the Ming's authority in the region. These interventions were swift and limited. Zheng He had no mandate to conquer or establish colonies. Instead, he sought stability and loyalty through diplomacy, ceremony, and, when necessary, decisive force. By the time the fourth voyage concluded in 1415, the Ming had established a presence in more than 30 states across Asia and the western Indian Ocean. Trade routes had been reinforced. Tribute missions to China increased. And the name Zheng was known from the ports of Arabia to the royal courts of Southeast Asia. He had become not just an admiral, but a cultural ambassador, a military commander, and a myth-maker, an emissary of a confident, outward-facing China. And yet, as his voyages grew bolder, the forces at home would soon begin to shift. By the time Zheng's fifth voyage began in 1417, the treasure fleet had become a floating symbol of imperial grandeur, moving with the weight of an empire behind it. Each journey carried not only the hopes of the Yongle Emperor but also the quiet scrutiny of those who questioned the cost and purpose of such immense expeditions. At sea, Zheng navigated foreign diplomacy. At home, he was increasingly sailing against political headwinds. Still, the fifth voyage unfolded with purpose and precision. This time, the fleet returned to familiar waters, Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula, but with renewed focus. Zheng was tasked with escorting emissaries from dozens of foreign lands back to their homelands after their visits to the Ming court. This voyage reinforced the circular nature of the tribute system. Foreign rulers offered symbolic gifts and allegiance, and China responded with generosity, titles, and ceremonial exchanges. One such encounter took place in the port city of Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. There, Zheng negotiated a maritime agreement that further secured Chinese access to crucial trade routes, enhancing the flow of goods such as lapis lazuli, pearls, and fine textiles. His reputation as a fair and intelligent envoy earned admiration, and local rulers welcomed the fleet not as conquerors, but as honored guests. But not all was calm. In China, the political tides were turning. The Yongle Emperor, whose support had made the treasure fleet possible, was aging and increasingly focused on internal projects, most notably, the construction of the Forbidden City in Beijing and ambitious military campaigns in the north against the Mongols. These efforts drained the treasury and diverted attention from overseas ambitions. More critically, court factions had begun to challenge the voyage's value. Confucian scholars, who traditionally viewed merchants and soldiers as lower in social status, argued that the expeditions were extravagant and unnecessary. They saw the tribute system as a distortion of proper order. An emperor should not need to court foreign recognition, they believed, and China's greatness did not require validation beyond its borders. Zheng, a eunuch and a Muslim, stood at the center of this ideological divide. The Confucian literati viewed eunuchs as politically dangerous and culturally suspect. Though Zheng had always acted with loyalty and discipline, his status made him vulnerable. His rise was inseparable from the favor of the Yongle Emperor, and when that favor waned, so too did the security of his mission. Still, Zheng pressed on. During the sixth voyage, launched in 1421, the fleet reached new depths of diplomatic success. One of the most remarkable achievements was the formal recognition of Chinese supremacy by the rulers of Mogadishu, Malindi, and other East African city-states. Envoys from these lands, dressed in vibrant cloth and bearing gifts of ivory, gold, and exotic animals, traveled back to China aboard the treasure ships. At court, they were received with the full splendor of Ming ceremony. Their presence served a dual purpose, reinforcing the grandeur of the emperor's court, and reminding critics that China's reach was unmatched. But in the same year, fate struck. The Yongle Emperor died suddenly while on a campaign against the Mongols. His death sent shockwaves through the empire. With him gone, the political support for Zheng's voyages evaporated almost overnight. The new emperor, Hongxi, was cautious and conservative. He recalled the fleet, suspended further expeditions, and ordered that many records of the voyages be limited or destroyed. Zheng, now in his 50s, returned to a homeland less willing to look outward. His ships were docked. His crews disbanded. But the sea still called. And one final voyage remained. The years following the Yongle Emperor's death were quiet ones for China's navy. The vast treasure fleet, once a symbol of imperial ambition, sat in harbor. The new emperor, Hongxi, feared overreach and turned inward, prioritizing Confucian orthodoxy and fiscal restraint over global engagement. Maritime exploration was viewed with skepticism, extravagant, unnecessary, even destabilizing. For a time, Zheng He faded from public life. No longer commanding a fleet, he took up administrative duties in Nanjing, his body aging and worn from decades at sea. The Grand Admiral who had once commanded 27,000 men and traversed the known world now worked quietly in the shadows of a court that had lost its appetite for bold ventures. But history has a way of circling back. In 1430, after nearly a decade of silence, the political winds shifted again. A new emperor, Xuande, grandson of Yongle, took the throne. Though more restrained than his grandfather, Xuande recognized the importance of maintaining China's influence abroad. Envoys from foreign states had stopped coming. Trade routes were weakening. Reports emerged of unrest in tributary states. The Ming could not risk being forgotten. And so, Zheng He was called upon one final time. Though now over 60, suffering from illness, and with his body weakened by years of hardship, Zheng He accepted the call. He began preparing for the seventh voyage, an expedition that would revisit the territories of earlier journeys, reaffirm Chinese prestige, and deliver imperial edicts to rulers who had grown distant. The fleet was smaller than in earlier voyages but still formidable. Dozens of ships. Thousands of men. Banners, gifts, officials, translators, guards. And at its helm, once more, the towering presence of the admiral who had already crossed the Indian Ocean 6 times. In 1431, the fleet departed Nanjing, heading down the Yangtze and out into the open sea. Ports across Southeast Asia once again welcomed the familiar red sails and dragon standards of the Ming. From Java to Sumatra, rulers reaffirmed their loyalty. In Calicut, India, the Chinese re-established trade routes and left emissaries behind. But Zheng He, now a shadow of his former self, would not return home. Accounts vary, but it is believed that Zheng He died at sea during the return leg of the voyage, likely in 1433. Some sources claim he died near Calicut. Others say he passed on while crossing the Indian Ocean. His death was not marked by fanfare or ceremony. There was no burial in his homeland, no imperial tomb. According to tradition, his body was wrapped in silk and committed to the sea he had spent his life mastering. Later, a symbolic tomb was erected for him in Nanjing, an empty grave on a quiet hillside, bearing his name but holding no remains. And just like that, the age of China's greatest naval commander came to an end. With Zheng He's passing, the Ming court quickly returned to isolationist policies. The treasure ships were decommissioned. Some were destroyed. Others rotted at dock. The records of the voyages were edited, censored, or lost. Within a generation, the memory of Zheng He's fleet had faded into legend. But across the ocean, in ports from Africa to Arabia, his memory endured longer. Sailors spoke of the giant ships that had once arrived bearing silk and silver. Rulers remembered the quiet, powerful admiral who had arrived with both gifts and resolve. Zheng He had crossed the world without conquering it. He had forged peace with presence. And though his country turned its back on the sea, he had shown what it meant for a civilization to reach beyond the horizon, with pride, with purpose, and with grace. After Zheng He's death in 1433, the fleet he once commanded made its slow journey back to China, carrying not only the riches and tributes of distant kingdoms, but also the ghost of the man who had shaped its destiny. There were no triumphant parades or imperial proclamations upon their return. Instead, a quiet stillness settled over the docks of Nanjing and the halls of the Forbidden City. The grand era of China's naval exploration was over. The Xuande Emperor, though respectful of Zheng He's legacy, had no desire to fund further expeditions. His reign, while more open than his father's, marked the beginning of a steady retreat from maritime ambition. Over time, the court grew more conservative. Future emperors favored internal stability over costly displays of power abroad. The shipyards that once echoed with the clang of construction fell silent. Naval personnel were reassigned. charts and logs began to vanish from the imperial archives. Within a few decades, the Ming dynasty issued strict edicts banning large-scale overseas voyages. China's foreign trade was restricted to certain ports. Shipbuilding for long-distance missions was discouraged, even forbidden. The reasons were complex: fiscal pressure, Confucian ideology, threats from the north, and internal court politics all played a part. But the result was unmistakable: a closing of China's maritime door to the world. Zheng He's voyages, once celebrated, were quietly relegated to the background. Court historians began to downplay their significance. Some records were deliberately destroyed, including ship logs and maps. The vast accomplishments of the treasure fleet were obscured, then forgotten. It was a stark contrast to what could have been. At the time of Zheng He's seventh voyage, China possessed the largest and most advanced navy in the world. Its shipyards could produce vessels unmatched by any other nation for centuries. Its navigators had charted vast swaths of ocean, and its diplomats had built peaceful relationships from Africa to Arabia. But all of that was abandoned, not in failure, but by choice. Meanwhile, in the West, the opposite course was unfolding. In 1492, nearly 60 years after Zheng He's final voyage, Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic Ocean in ships that were tiny compared to the Ming treasure ships. His journey, like Zheng He's, was driven by ambition and royal sponsorship. But where Zheng He had sought tribute and diplomacy, Columbus sought conquest and wealth. Within a few decades, Western powers would begin carving colonies across the globe. Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and later Britain and France expanded their naval reach, driven by a hunger for land, trade, and empire. The age of exploration had begun, without China. Some historians have called this one of the great turning points in world history, the moment when the nation most capable of global leadership turned inward, and others filled the vacuum. Had China continued its maritime program, the map of the world might have looked very different. And yet, while Zheng He was forgotten in China's official history, his legacy lived on at the edges of memory. In distant ports, old men still told stories of ships so large they darkened the horizon. In the Indian Ocean, Chinese porcelain buried in sand was found centuries later. Along the Swahili coast, oral traditions remembered envoys from a faraway emperor who spoke through interpreters and brought gifts unlike any seen before. In these whispers, Zheng He endured. Though his country turned away from the sea, the waves still remembered his sails. And while others explored to conquer, Zheng He had explored to connect. It was a different vision of empire, one born not of domination, but of dignity. Though China's official chronicles grew silent about Zheng He, traces of his epic voyages endured far from the forbidden city, in coral harbors, crumbling ruins, and the shared memory of coastal communities touched by his sails. Along the Swahili coast of East Africa, in places like Malindi and Mombasa, legends told of visitors who arrived in ships larger than anything seen before or since. The locals described pale-faced emissaries dressed in fine silk robes who came not to plunder, but to trade. They brought precious porcelain, carved jade, tea, and embroidered banners. In return, they took spices, ivory, and exotic animals, giraffes, zebras, and lions. To this day, Chinese ceramics dating back to the early 15th century have been excavated in these African port cities. Kilns had never existed there. The porcelain could only have come from one source, the treasure ships of Zheng He. Further evidence appeared in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, and on the coasts of Arabia. Ming porcelain was found beneath layers of centuries-old sediment. Tombstones bearing Chinese inscriptions rested in quiet graveyards, including one for a Chinese sailor who had died far from home and had been buried with honor in a foreign land. In Southeast Asia, some islanders believed Zheng He was a god, or at least a figure touched by divine favor. Even in his native Yunnan province, far from the sea, Zheng He's legacy took root in unexpected ways. Temples dedicated to him sprang up, not as war memorials, but as shrines honoring a protector of travelers, a guardian of peace, and a champion of global harmony. In these temples, incense still burns, not only for the admiral, but for the idea of connection he represented. For Zheng he had never sought conquest. Where European explorers planted flags and built fortresses, he built relationships. Where others imposed religion, he carried tolerance. A devout Muslim in service of a Confucian emperor, Zheng he respected all beliefs. He visited Hindu temples in India, prayed at mosques in Mecca, and observed Buddhist rituals across Southeast Asia. This spirit of pluralism resonated deeply in the lands he visited. He did not arrive to change them, but to understand, to engage, and to offer the open hand of mutual respect. It was a rare model for the time, and even rarer in what came after. In the decades following his death, the world shifted. Portuguese caravels began to appear in the Indian Ocean. The era of European gunpowder empires had begun. The balance of maritime power moved westward, driven by greed, competition, and conquest. The oceans became theaters of war and exploitation. In contrast, Zheng He's voyages faded like a calm tide, gentle, remembered only where they had left harmony, not fire. Yet in the quiet, there was loss. A civilization that had once touched 3 continents through peaceful engagement turned inward and closed its ports. For centuries, China's official stance discouraged maritime contact. Even maps became censored. The detailed navigational knowledge collected by Zheng He's officers, currents, coasts, stars, ports, vanished from common use. The treasure ships rotted away. The sailors grew old and died, their stories carried only by descendants and folklore. And yet, Zheng He never truly disappeared. His image resurfaced time and again, sometimes as myth, sometimes as memory, sometimes as an icon of what might have been. He became a mirror, reflecting not only China's past, but a question to the world. What if the seas had been shaped not by conquest, but by connection? For centuries, the name Zheng He lingered in the margins of Chinese history, mentioned in temple prayers and local legends, but rarely studied in official texts. His massive expeditions, once the pride of the Ming court, became curiosities, dismissed by later historians as excessive or irrelevant. China had turned inward, and so too had its memory. But the tides of history shifted again in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, scholars began to uncover forgotten manuscripts and imperial records. Among them were fragments that hinted at something astonishing, detailed accounts of vast fleets, foreign tributes, and a grand admiral who had traveled beyond the seas of the empire. Slowly, piece by piece, the story of Zheng He began to emerge from beneath the dust of neglect. The rediscovery coincided with a period of national soul-searching. As China faced foreign invasions, civil war, and revolution, intellectuals began to ask what had gone wrong. Why had a civilization so advanced in science, trade, and shipbuilding fallen behind the West? Zheng He's story became a powerful answer, and a symbol. Here was proof that China had once looked outward, led the seas, and interacted peacefully with the world. It challenged the narrative that Western imperialism was inevitable. More than that, it offered an alternative vision of power, not through colonization, but through diplomacy, culture, and respect. By the late 20th century, the Chinese government began to embrace Zheng He's legacy. Statues were erected in his honor, in Nanjing, in Kunming, and along the ports of his famous voyages. His tomb in Nanjing, once neglected, was restored. Schools taught his name. Ships were rebuilt in his likeness. And in 2005, to mark the 600th anniversary of his first voyage, China held large national celebrations, calling Zheng He a messenger of peace. Yet the question remained, why had his legacy been buried for so long? One reason lay in the Confucian view that trade and exploration were lesser pursuits, unworthy of scholarly attention. Another was political. The maritime faction of the Ming court, which included Zheng He, lost power after the Yongle emperor's death. Their accomplishments were not celebrated because they did not serve the priorities of the ruling class that followed. But perhaps the deeper reason is that Zheng He did not fit neatly into the archetypes of conquest or empire. He did not conquer territories, nor did he leave behind garrisons or colonies. He did not spark wars or demand submission. His legacy was one of connection, not domination. In a world that often measures greatness by the borders drawn or battles won, his achievements were harder to categorize, and easier to forget. Today, his story resonates more powerfully than ever. As global tensions rise and cultures collide, Zheng He's voyages offer a model from the past that speaks to the present. He was a bridge between civilizations, a Muslim Chinese admiral who led Buddhist, Confucian, and Hindu sailors across oceans to meet Arab, African, and Indian rulers in peace. He proved that power need not be violent, that presence could be persuasive, and that respect could travel farther than force. Zheng He's journeys remind us that exploration is not just about discovering new lands, but about building new relationships. His ships carried more than goods. They carried understanding, diplomacy, and the promise of mutual prosperity. His sails are long gone, but his compass still points towards something greater. Not east or west. Not conquest or retreat. But forward, toward a world bound not by walls or wars, but by waves and wonder. In the modern age, Zheng He has become more than a historical figure. He is a symbol, a touchstone for dialogue between past and present, between China and the world, between ambition and restraint. Across Asia and beyond, ports that once welcomed his fleet now honor his name with statues, museums, and commemorations. In China, his story is taught as part of a proud maritime legacy, a reminder of what was possible and what was lost. But Zheng He's story is also a mirror. In his life, we see the complexities of empire, the promise of exploration, and the peril of forgetting. He was born into the chaos of a collapsing dynasty, rose through a system that both empowered and mutilated him, and ascended to a role of unparalleled influence without ever seeking a throne or title for himself. He wielded immense power, commanding the greatest naval fleet of his time, yet never ruled. He traveled thousands of miles, influenced dozens of kingdoms, and left no colony or conquest in his wake. What he left instead were relationships. In a time when much of the world equated greatness with domination, Zheng He showed that strength could be expressed through diplomacy, that respect could forge loyalty, and that understanding could travel across language, religion, and culture. His ships did not carry missionaries or muskets. They carried translators, gifts, scholars, and silk. When violence occurred, it was swift and minimal. His purpose was not to occupy, but to awe, to connect, and to represent a confident civilization without arrogance. This model of global engagement, grounded in culture and exchange, has special relevance today. As nations wrestle with how to assert influence without triggering conflict, Zheng He's voyages offer an early blueprint: how to project strength without oppression, and how to build bridges without burning others. Still, the irony of Zheng He's story is its end. Despite all he accomplished, his achievements were buried by those who came after him. His ships were dismantled, his records destroyed, and his name removed from official histories for centuries. Why? Because he challenged the dominant ideology of the time. He looked outward when the empire turned inward. He represented a global China when others wanted isolation. And yet, he was not truly erased. He survived in poetry, in oral tales, in porcelain shards washed ashore, in weathered inscriptions on distant tombs, in sailors' stories passed from one generation to the next. And now, in the digital age, he sails again, this time in textbooks, documentaries, and online archives. He has become an icon of peaceful power, a rare figure celebrated not for conquest, but for communication. If history is a sea, then Zheng He's legacy is a current, sometimes submerged, always moving, shaping the shores of memory and imagination. His voyages are not just a chapter of China's past. They are a story of what the world could look like when we choose understanding over conflict, presence over plunder. And so, while his ships are gone and his compass lies still, the wake he left behind continues to ripple across oceans and centuries. Zheng He, the admiral of the Ming, the Muslim eunuch from Yunnan, the man who touched 3 continents without spilling blood, has finally returned to the world stage. Not as a conqueror. Not as a forgotten ghost. But as a reminder that the greatest journeys are not always those that claim, but those that connect.